My name is Michael Galopter. I'm the executive director of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. And I have been I've been a clean tech entrepreneur for about 12 years of my life at different times as well. So that's me. I want to introduce our speakers, and hopefully we'll have a lively conversation about equity and how to break molds and do amazing things in the space. Our first speaker is, I'm going to just introduce both of them so you all know who's on stage. Taj Ahmad Eldridge is a founder, a poet, and an investor. He is presently the managing director of climate innovation at Jobs for the Future and a co-founder of Include Ventures. My favorite job he had before that was as senior director of investment at LACI, the Los Angeles Clean Incubator. Was it being run by Matt Peterson then?
It still is.
Still is. My wonderful friend, Matt Peterson, and Gorbachev's friend too, by the way. Secret that you don't know about him.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a wonderful institution in Los Angeles, one of the really leading incubators, as is a lot of the work that Taj is doing now. So that's our first one of our panelists. Second one, Nicole, holds a really interesting position. She's the first director, right, of public engagement?
No, I am not. Actually.
Oh, you weren't?
Okay. I'm the inaugural deputy director and now acting director. The first director of OPP was Ellen Katz, who is former Connecticut Consumer Counsel.
Oh. How long has there been a director of public engagement?
The office has been around for about 2 years.
Okay.
2 years and some change.
Yeah, and FERC's been around since the 1950s, as I recall. So I think I'm amazed that it was pretty new, right? I think putting wires up all over the country and power plants all over the country, they would have figured out public engagement before 2 years ago. So I'm amazed and thrilled that you're here.
I'll give some more context.
Yeah, absolutely. And before that, she was VP of Public Policy at Sustainable Capital Advisors and Senior Manager of Public Policy at Sunrun. Started her career in civil rights and employment law firm. And she is most critically an advisor to our own Center for Business and Environment here at Yale. So please welcome our speakers, and we'll start with some questions. Do you want to give context first, or wait till we get to your question?
I do, actually. So I am currently employed by the federal government, but I'm here in my personal capacity today. As an alum, I went to Yale College, was in Davenport, spent a lot of time at the House. I'm here in my personal capacity. We'll be sharing some personal views that does not reflect any position of the commissioner, any particular commissioners. So with that, I just wanted to kind of level set on that first.
Absolutely. And for those of you following equity in the development of large power facilities and large infrastructure, it's pretty heavy lifting, so she has good reason to be somewhat careful about public statements, so thank you for being here, for sure. With that, I want to start with the first question that we kind of came up with together, which is, why does equity matter? And what are some of the things that drive it? Todd?
Yeah, good question. I think sometimes when we talk about equity, we talk about it from a standpoint of it's a good thing to do, it's moralistic. I'm an economist and a venture capitalist. Sometimes it makes economic sense. A lot of times we talk about, from a risk standpoint of investing, that we want to buy low and sell high. We want to go into territories that are unmarked, underutilized. And when we talk about equity, we need to think about there's a huge swath of this country that has been underutilized when we talk about the idea of energy in this space. Further, one of the things I'm always interested in is that we talk about this idea of a just transition, and I often ask, just for who? Right? Because there's a lot of opportunities to where we're talking about a lot of these things that, from an energy transition, trying to get to net zero and these things, that we can't do it just with the people who have money to do so. We can't just do it in California. We can't just do it in Connecticut. It has to be a global and a national type of focus to ensure that we have a true just transition in this space. So for me, equity means economics. It means a way to really kind of lift up our country and to ensure that this just transition is a transition for all. And it makes economic sense and policy sense as well.
Thank you. Nicole?
So to build on that, for me, working in this space, living in this space for a long time, and building relationships with so many grassroots organizations and environmental justice giants, people who have been on the ground really connecting with communities for decades, I come with kind of a first level acceptance and awareness that our current energy infrastructure, our energy delivery system, our economy has been built on the backs of communities of color with their free labor. The coal industry in the early days took advantage of convict leasing post-Reconstruction to set itself up. And so there's an awareness that communities of color, Black people, tribal communities, I'll be specific, have been either left out of the benefits, the true benefits of our energy economy, and or have really been abused by the process up to this point in terms of infrastructure, in terms of policy, and certainly in terms of the money and capital. So for me, equity is actually central. We're in this space right now where we can really redress, address, make up for, and perhaps repair the past harm that our energy delivery system has caused so many people. And we're in the space now where we can center people in this work and in building out kind of this new frontier that we're in, this wonderful space that we're in, of building out new infrastructure and facilitating new technologies. We can really center the people who have been left out. We have a moral mandate to do that, and it's a democratic approach, to moving forward with clean energy, with resilient energy and reliable energy. So equity for me is really at the center of all the work that's being done right now, even though I know that there are some actors, some voices currently who strongly disagree with that approach. But there are so many more communities who will not let up and who have been working on this for decades, and for whom it's a huge priority.
Yep. Absolutely. And clean energy, as we know, is by and large much more labor intensive than capital intensive, right? So naturally more democratic economically as well. What's the coolest stuff you're seeing in innovation, in equity? Innovation and equity, what's the coolest stuff you've seen or good examples of amazing work to make this happen?
Everything Taj is working.
No, a lot of times when I think about this idea of clean energy, clean climate resilience, I think that the speaking today, I was smiling there because they were talking about things I love: energy storage, looking at community solar. But I think we have to open the aperture about what climate resiliency, what clean tech and green tech is, right? Everything in my body is about sustainability, right? From the hats that's made out of waste material, from these sparkly things on my wrists that are actually taken from carbon that's been in the air, to my clothes that are made from low water cotton. So I think that when we're talking about this space, we have to communicate it in a way to where I kind of call it climate code switching. I don't talk about climate the same way when I'm in California, when I'm talking with my colleagues who know it. I talk about it differently when I'm in my hometown of Dallas, Texas, because there it's less about climate, it's less about green, but it's about what impacts them. I talk about it from a standpoint of public health and what I call green wealth. Those two things are what resonate. When I'm in Mississippi, I talk about it differently. And so I think that the coolest thing for me is this idea that these conversations are happening, and they're happening in these communities that you never would have thought, but they've been there. And the thing about it was interesting. I just came back from Dominican Republic, and a lot of things that they're doing there, we might call here upcycling, we might call it, circular economy. They're just calling it life, right? And the communities have been doing that forever, from indigenous communities that Nicole just talked about to others. And so for me, what's the coolest things is the fact that people are finally connecting the investment community, the policy community, the activist community, and the community together. And we're finally speaking the same language. Last year I was here speaking, but I was up there instead of right here. And I mentioned this book called Words That Work by a guy by the name of Frank Luntz. And I saw a student, I don't know if he's here, we met in a hotel, and he said, I remember that book. So bravo for remembering and reading. But the key to that book for me was the fact that communication is key. You mentioned me having a poetry degree, and my graduate degree is in economics. There's a reason for that. Because for me, it's the poetry and the literature is about, we have to speak differently to ensure that we're building this great tent. Otherwise, it gets left behind. So for me, it's the coolest things are the people. The technology-wise, the clothing, I love it. I'm a fashion guy, so I love advanced materials in the climate space.
That was Frank Luntz's book?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Frank Luntz is one of the architects of conservative communication in America today, but he refuses to work on the wrong side of climate, blessedly. And I love that climate code switching. Thank you very much. For some of you who may not be in tech, code switching is a word we use a lot in high tech to help diversify that field, because there is such a different language spoken among particularly American folks from different cultures, from non-mainstream cultures, as they try to enter tech. So code switching has been a key set of trainings and things like that. So I love climate code switching, which applies kind of to everybody, right?
Absolutely.
So in some sense, you have to switch code in Texas compared to California.
Absolutely.
It's geographically based as well as maybe based on...
When I'm speaking Dominican in Dominican Republic,
Yeah.
and instead of in Mexico, where I say, ¿Cómo tú estás? And you may hear it as, ¿Cómo estás?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So definitely.
Or in Philly, it's just what up.
Yeah?
Where I'm from.
How about you? What are some great examples of climate innovation, besides the existence of your office?
Thank you. So I just want to continue that theme, actually. Very excited and motivated by all the wonderful people I'm working with at the Office of Public Participation at FERC. And this truly is an innovative effort. But also, I watched the tape of the Treasury had the Freedmen's Bank Forum the other day. I think it was last week.
Yep.
And Maya Wiley was one of the speakers. And, the theme was, how do we make sure that, communities of color, low-income communities can benefit from greater access to capital. And the theme that, folks talked about throughout that event, I highly recommend you watch it, was about translating very complex technical topics to communities so that there's greater understanding, greater ability to exchange information even amongst themselves. So translating based on the priorities of communities is a theme that I'm seeing more organizations kind of tap into that. OPP certainly is an innovative enterprise, but frankly, we've been just taking notes from organizations that have been doing the work of, providing information about how to access regulatory processes, providing education about, energy topics, facilitating, intervention writing and comment writing, and helping folks understand that their voice is critical to energy regulatory processes. It's nothing actually new, but what I am seeing is there is definitely a growing groundswell of activity around communication. And it's really exciting to see. Also, what I'm excited about is, right now, there is a great deal of conversation about how the big companies can integrate equity into their business model. And that's an appropriate conversation. I think larger companies need to be thinking along those lines. But what I'm excited to see is actually more small, Main Street, Black and Brown owned businesses growing in this space and kind of staking their claim to the financial benefits that are on the horizon for the large scale deployment of fill in the blank technology. So the more entrepreneurship, more kind of partnerships between community organizations, larger companies, and utilities. There are some utilities that are really prioritizing partnerships with small to medium-sized businesses owned by people of color.
And can I add to that to give some concrete examples too? Because I love this idea about, again, the entrepreneurs, the community, policy working together. So as an example, in the city of Atlanta, the chief sustainability officer there, she partnered with an organization called Clean Energy Culture. I serve on the board of Clean Energy Culture. And what's interesting about them is that they're bringing this idea of pop culture to climate, right? They're getting people in the music space to invest in climate companies. How many people, show of hand, have heard of Bad Bunny? I should say have an album, the new album. He's into climate. He's focused. He ended up being an investor in a company that's focusing on building these sustainable, biodegradable shoes. There's several entertainers. Somebody may know this person named Drake, right? It's a little entertainer. Show of hands. If you do, he's invested into a protein food company, plant-based food company in LA. And for the Atlanta example is that what they decided to do with the city and this organization, Clean Energy Culture, is partner with the clubs that are in Atlanta, the nightlife, which you never hear about this idea of climate, right? The way they partnered with them was that they had Uber as a sponsor. And what they said was anybody who came to the club in an electric Uber, they get a discount for attendance. So you had all these people coming to the club in these Ubers. The real goal was not for those people coming, it's for them to educate, but the real goal was to show the business owner that, hey, I might need to have charging infrastructure here. Because I'm seeing all these people who then are there talking about their own electric vehicles that they're driving, all this sort of stuff. And it's a way for them to start having the conversation about, now I'm having this charging infrastructure, what about other ways to lower my cost of doing business? And so for me, that's one of the ways that we need to get the tech culture aligned with the small business culture, aligned with community culture in order to push this thing forward.
And shout out to Chandra Farley.
That's right. That's the Chief
Sustainability
Officer of City of Atlanta, definitely.
She's amazing.
She was the brainchild.
Be a part of this conference next year. We're
Absolutely.
Chandra Farley.
So I want to come back in a minute to a little bit of the diversity within communities of color, like by geography, indigenous, Latino, et cetera. But let's stick with this theme of investment and business and talk about the IRA, which is, sort of the elephant in the room that we know is there, right? There's between the IRA, the Build Back Better, and the CHIPS Act, $2 trillion in infrastructure investment. One of the first executive orders President Biden signed was the Justice 40, which said that 40% of the benefits of $2 trillion in investment needs to flow to those communities. So what do you see? How do you see that as shaping the field of equity? Particularly, what are the biggest opportunities, and then what are the fears you have about whether we're going to achieve that goal of Justice 40?
I'll start. I think, number one, I was excited as an investor and a person who's been in climate for many years prior to the policies that came in place. It was interesting that we started seeing a lot of these other funds that I call climate curious kind of come into the space, right? That they didn't really focus on climate, but then they said, we have this curiosity around it because there's some federal money there that may help my portfolio. And for me, I'm thinking that that's a start, right? Because you need to start having these conversations. But I'll start seeing from the investor community a lot more focus. And then also I'll start seeing, because of that, a lot more people of color coming in as investors. And for me, the reason why that's important is because in venture, at least, investment is about the network, right? So you're bringing in not only your own network, but you're expanding that. And I think that comes into the equity space of it as well. I mean, you mentioned my background growing up in Texas, with poetry degree initially. I wasn't into venture when I first came, but I realized it through reading a book by a guy by the name of Reginald Lewis. And I think that that's one of the things I loved about what these two policies have done is put it on the forefront of people to say that now you have capital that's coming in addition to the risk capital, you have the policy capital. My thing is always that you need to also have the public who are doing the voting understand the benefits of this. And I think that's where we need to do a little bit more work on is ensuring that people understand. We have a grant product at JFF Labs that we provided capital and training assistance to a number of communities, both rural and indigenous. And I think I keep hearing is that they love all these policy work, but it feels like drinking out of a water hose because there's so much information, so much opportunity. And I think a lot of times when we think about these laws, we think about the city of Los Angeles. We can certainly handle what's happening in New York. But what about like Las Cruces, New Mexico, or like other small Memphis, Tennessee, that are these second tier or smaller cities that need to have this understanding. So I see it as a double-edged sword where there's a lot of benefit that's been happening and awareness. But the other part about that is we have to work harder to ensure a lot of these other communities have access and understand what that access is and how to actually build upon it. Or it's just wash dollars that won't be effective as we need it to be effective. And we first talked about this idea of broadening the community and the aperture of who gets access to these funds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Obviously historic and really driven by the advocacy of so many communities of color over the years. It's like it was a culmination of years of work that led to the IRA, that led to Justice 40. What Justice 40 is actually modeled after, I believe, a New York program that was crafted by clean energy equity advocates in that state. So certainly excited about the prospect of, and actually some money's already flowing, that organizations, businesses focused on benefiting Black and brown communities economically are getting access to that money. I am a little concerned about, certainly with the IRA, and there's this emphasis on shovel readiness for access to the funds. So that, kind of the short turnaround for dispersing the money, and that, from what I've heard from people that I know, is of great concern, because there are businesses who have been around for a good 10, 15 years, doing well, serving their communities, who just don't have the financial backing to be able to have a project that's shovel ready the way that a larger player might. So that is something that I've heard some concerns about. But overall, I know that there are people who are many of our friends who are working really hard in the administration and at the state and local level, just to make sure that the right people who need that capital get their hands on that capital.
Yeah, no, Macron, President of France, flew over right after the IRA passed because he thought it was a violation of World Trade Organization rules. We would spend so much money. So we're not used to it, particularly in low-income communities and smaller communities, or rural communities, not used to thinking about absorbing that much capital. So it's a huge obstacle. One of the reasons we're starting at between CBAE and the Center for Environmental Justice, the Certificate in Clean and Equitable Energy Development is launching in January, specifically to try to start training cadres of local officials, low-income folks in communities around the world in how to ideate and design their own projects. And one of the central challenges is the shovel readiness question. Is there are communities that are going to have shovel ready, whether they're because they're upper class or because they're a big city with a big engineering department, and we're afraid that there's so much money out there that by the time the smaller players get the money or the less advantaged players get the money, the pool of developers who can spend that money for them will shrink. And the federal government's working on this. But for those of you in the audience who have businesses that do this work, there's a huge amount of opportunity, huge amount of advantage in the bidding to think about how to serve, to get yourself ready to serve disadvantaged communities and to work with smaller communities as well to help get that money in place across the whole country. We don't want to have a system where we have big cities that are electrified and then everyone else still using a lot of fossil fuels or whatever else. So, all right, let's turn to internationally a little bit, or actually let's just staying within the United States. What are some observations you have among diversity within communities of color, within different rural, urban, indigenous, and Native American, Asian American, Latino American? Any differences you're seeing in those communities? Things that people should watch out for as they approach diverse communities in different ways, perhaps?
Well, from the work that I do, just have become very kind of intimately aware of the challenges of so many tribal communities across this country in terms of engaging with federal agencies. The federal family has some ways to go, and this is why I gave the disclaimer, in terms of meaningful consultation with tribal leadership. And there is also this limitation that under the rules that tribal consultation only occurs with federally recognized tribes. There's just a lot that the government can do to kind of improve that framework and actually kind of act on its responsibilities to meaningfully engage with tribal leadership, because we are talking about sovereign nations, right? And we have ways to go to really show respect and honor for that status in terms of kind of energy planning, energy deployment. We really need to, a lot of work has to be done to center the work that Commission is doing, that any other agency, state, local, is doing around what communities have prioritized for themselves, Not all the time what the utilities think might be ideal or practical or just and reasonable. They have their experts, their whole squads of experts But there also needs to be a focus and prioritization around the work and scholarship and expertise of tribal communities. In terms of kind of the urban space, I'm very passionate about that space because that's kind of my personal context. I'm from Philadelphia originally, long history of, every city, redlining, real blight in certain neighborhoods in the city. And, now everybody wants to put solar panels on. And I work, I love some solar. Yeah. Solar and battery storage. I'm all about the virtual power plant future. But, there's still a real disconnect, I believe, between industries, awareness and sensitivity to the history of disinvestment in cities, and, there has to be a more kind of holistic approach to the challenges that so many communities of color in urban situations are facing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And one of the things, I don't speak a lot because I'm very transparent, but I think we need transparency when we talk about these subjects and these issues. Mm-hmm. There's three things. Number one, to your point, we talk about diversity a lot, but we need to also recognize geographic diversity. That's number one. The second thing is that sometimes when we have these conversations about equity in communities, we're defining the communities instead of letting the communities define themselves. Not every Black person is a monolith. Not every Latino person is a monolith. Not every tribe or whatever are monolith. So we need to kind of keep that in mind as we're doing this. And to Nicole's point about Philadelphia, and so many other cities feel the same way. I heard this once from someone, and it was shocking to me, but I had to understand it from their vantage point. They said that dealing with, a lot of times, the federal government, even dealing with venture capitalists who look like myself, they said it's like being in a relationship with someone you love that's abusive. You love them, but you don't like what they do to you, and you want them to change. And I think we have to think about that sometimes with certain people, is that we come in with our best intentions, but those intentions may not be looked at the same way because of history, of neglect and feeling. So sometimes we have to come, instead of with product or solutions first, we have to come with open ears and listen and talk. And I think that's one of the things that's been missing in our industry as we talk about the idea of equity and energy, is that we just can't go into these communities and say, here, this is going to save you money, put it up, blah, blah, blah. Right. We have to educate, and sometimes we have to have what I call cheerleaders or advocates from those communities who are going to help us get those solutions in, because there's a lot of mistrust. We got to remember, we're still in my opinion, in the infancy phase, in adolescent phase of climate, of clean tech and clean energy. We had the infancy phase 1.0, years ago, for some of us might remember during the Solyndra days. So it's still that short time period of people remembering that there was all these promises of money, all these promises of jobs, all these trainings when nothing came about. So there was a lack of trust. And so I think that's one of the things we have to think about is really, before we start deploying, really have these relationships, have these communities involved, and again, allow the communities to define themselves.
Mm-hmm. And just to make up, on the indigenous front, somewhere between, I don't have the number at the top of my head anymore, between 20 and 40% of renewable energy resource in America is on indigenous territory, controlled today by tribal folks. So they're a critical player. And then one of the things, I sit on a lot of national environmental boards, and like a broken record for years, been saying, if whether you're a local official, a state official, or a federal official, if all your voters are white, you're against climate policy. So we have to connect the dots between the political support for what we're doing and the economic and ground level reality. So although it may be hard to work in these communities also represent the backbone, right, politically, of what we're doing, why we're spending trillions of dollars and things like that. Yeah. So with that, I want to open it up for questions, please. We have about 10 minutes for that. Any questions for our amazing panelists?
First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for the panel. It's been insightful. And my question is that as we think about the green energy transition, we look into the future, what do we need to be wary of? Because in every transition, there's the possibility of bad outcomes for communities of color. What do we need to be thinking about as leaders, entrepreneurs, investors, to avoid those negative outcomes with this new transition?
Great question. And I want to kind of give a really quick example about that, why that's important. Unintended consequences. We can mean so much well, but we're not thinking about the global picture. And I think as entrepreneurs, I'm a former founder myself. It's very hard to do so. And I think this is where the team comes in and ensuring you're building a great team. Because I think someone earlier mentioned lithium-ion batteries, EV batteries and things. What I think about in that, as we make this transition to electric vehicles, I think about cobalt. Why I think about cobalt is think about how that's being resourced right now in the Democratic Republic of Congo and how those people are being treated. And so for me, and I first started out by saying the just transition is not just for everyone. And so for me, that's one of the things I'm always thinking about is that when I'm talking about equity, I'm looking at equity from a global lens and more than just about, the things we're thinking about, because I think that that's one thing to do as a founder is to kind of start thinking about how these things are going to have any unintended consequences. Now, as an investor, again, I mentioned that we're in the adolescent phase, so there's going to be a lot of missteps. There's going to be a lot of changes, and I think that's one of the things we have to welcome. Also, is that we're still in the first phases of trying to figure out how can we have a just, clean transition, and so there are going to be some missteps. But I think the first thing is try to mitigate those unintended consequences as much as possible.
You good with that?
Yeah.
All right. You want to try speaking loudly in the meantime?
Oh, we can
There
hear
you
you.
go.
So you hear a lot of talk about jobs being, one of the big exciting parts of this, transition to clean energy. And I'm interested in your insights into, what you think the crucial things are to do in order to make sure we're getting those, new jobs into communities of color, and where people need jobs most.
Well, I know that there's a lot of great work being done at the federal and state and local level around community benefits agreements. Another version is community workforce agreements, where if a developer or large company would like to do business in a community, there needs to be a serious kind of meeting of the minds on job benefits for those communities that is enforceable in a court of law. And so just really, it really does start, I believe, kind of taking several steps back. It starts with really meaningful community engagement. Now that is a buzzword that everybody's throwing around these days, but real kind of organizations, companies really need to devote staffing, resources, and time towards building kind of those crucial relationships in communities so that there is trust built and, they can eventually come to, some sort of mutual understanding about jobs and wages and other things that, communities really need.
And let me add the other hat. I often say I wear many hats, both literally and figuratively. The hat up there that says climate innovations, that's exactly where we're focused on jobs and workforce. And it's ironically, it's funded by a private equity company called Ares, and it's called CREST, Climate Resilient Employees for Sustainable Tomorrow. The goal there is creating 25,000 jobs in 5 years in climate resiliency across the U.S. When I think about diversity, we kept talking about this idea of diversity not being a monolith. I don't think about communities of color and we're talking about equity. I'm thinking about educational attainment equity. So not everybody's going to have a advanced degree like some of us here going into the climate green workforce. Not everybody's going to have a degree. Some people may have gone to community college. Some people may have just went to high school. But those people need to also participate in this green just transition. And I love the fact that there are certifications being offered here, because one of the things we'd also believe is that the future of the green workforce may just be lifelong learning around certificates, where you're stacking certificates on top of certificates as opposed to just going to a degree, to a school. Sorry, Yale, but That may be it for some people, where you're having this idea of having a digital wallet to certify your learnings and saying, I have this skill, have this skill. So there's no longer occupational segregation. So you can go to, you can first be working with EVSEs and charging infrastructure. Then you may get a certificate to go work on actual electric vehicles. Like one in California, this is literally turning a 1979 Monte Carlo into an EV for me. So I'm excited about this idea of workforce, but I would definitely advise you to check out Crest from Jobs for the Future, because great work around climate and workforce.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions at most. So,
hi, thank you. I think you touched upon this a little bit in terms of, wanting communities to define themselves. Like, how do you determine which communities would get the money funneled into that? In California, there's a tool called CalEnviroScreen, which looks at environmental indicators like how burned they are with ozone, also socioeconomic factors like language isolation. What does the federal government use? What do you think should be used?
In terms of tools for identifying communities, is that the core of your question? Most important tool is just get out and meet folks. Old-fashioned, just kind of get to know your community right where you are. But also, there is EPA has a EJ tool. White House has an EJ and clean energy equity tool. So there's a whole host, and different states have their own too. Maryland has one in my neck of the woods where I live right now. So there are a lot of opportunities to kind of dig into data and look at some maps and census tracts and what have you. But I guess I'm more kind of a little bit old school, and I just believe in kind of putting forth the effort, the organic effort to meet the grass tops leaders in your own community, and start building some real relationships. And those grass tops know folks in other parts of the country. And that's where the real kind of meaty information sharing and community identification can be the most powerful.
and there are economic incentives for both of those. If you're using the formal tools like the Justice 40 tool, you're going to have advantages in bids that you submit to the federal government. And if you have a great story to tell in your own community, you're going to have better customers, more investors, more traction in the market, right? Last question. Go ahead.
I think that's me. So great panel. Thank you. To what extent do you think environmental justice is retrospective and remedial? We talk a lot about the Justice 40 investments to, include disadvantaged communities in the prospective investments we're going to make through the IRA, the Yale, and a whole bunch of other bills. But we've talked about the history of environmental injustice as it pertains to convict leasing, as it pertains to redlined communities. So in your sort of global view of what environmental justice is, to what extent is it remedial to you? Thank you.
I'll start. Good question. And if you notice, when I first began, or I first talked about it, I talked this idea about justice and environmental justice and equity from the lens as an investor. And I talked about it in the language that we understand, which is the economics of it, the return of it. And I think that you have to have a balance. Going back to that idea of common close switching, is that I think environmental justice is going to mean certain things to certain people, and that there is an idea for some of us where it is remedial, where it is going out and fixing some of the problems that have been long lasting. I'm a walking example of that. I think I mentioned last year that where I grew up in Dallas, the reason I couldn't be here last year because I had kidney failure from environmental factors. So when we talk about environmental factors, it's about public health, and I'm here today because of a transplant. But I would say though is that again, there's not, you shouldn't just have one language or lane to be talking about this issue. It should be from many different facets. But for me, it's all about, I don't care what your gateway is, as long as we get to the same goal, which is ensuring these communities have access, these communities have solutions, and they have power over those solutions as well.
Cool.
That's just such a powerful and important question. For me, it is very much, I just come to this with the mindset of being centered in history. And so, yes, it is. And I do believe that there is, there's space for conversation around reparations, climate reparations. We probably won't see any type of movement on that policy-wise anytime soon. but I do believe that it's an important conversation that needs to continue in a real meaningful way.
And thank you for that question as we wrap up. We had an environmental justice conference entitled Environmental Joy a week and a half ago.
Sure.
One more question? Okay, go ahead. Well, let me say, we just had this conference on environmental joy. Environmental justice communities, we have to react to prevent the harms that are happening, but they're also incredibly generative. They've been at the front lines. The Anthropocene started 500 years ago for indigenous people. There are a lot of solutions in our communities that we need to all learn from. And if the stuff isn't cheap enough and easy enough to work in the communities that are at the front lines, it's not going to work in enough places. Last question? Who was it?
You get one more question.
Oh, we get one more question. Okay, go for it. Sorry. Over there. Thank you, Rob.
You know, my question was going to be all those made out of bamboo or
They are actually, yes.
Okay, there you go.
My daughter designed it
There you
and
go.
shows it. And
All right.
Anyway.
Okay, good.
Hi. So, great panel.
Good question.
And I wanted to ask, you mentioned community workforce benefits. I think kind of long term, and all of these climate solutions and businesses are going to be coming into communities of color to help them. So how are you going to prevent things like the housing market, like the increase in prices in homes? How does that community stay there and actually benefit from those types of things?
I can give you a quick answer.
Yeah.
Take a look at, you guys have answers? Yeah, Dudley.
I'll let you go.
Check out Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston, Roxbury, 40 years of experience in managing gentrification and keeping wealth in the community. We do have to think about that. We have to think about things like community benefits agreements. There are lots of ways to create land trusts in communities to kind of give communities a reasonable return on the improvements that are happening in their communities without having them chased out by prices going up and things like that. But we have to definitely it's not easy. We have to pay attention to it for sure.
Yeah, and that's why I talked about this idea of owning the solutions, because I think that part of it also is building wealth in those communities, and this idea of jobs and ensuring that we're having not just green jobs, but quality green jobs. When I talk about quality, that not only means how much you're getting paid, but the return, the joy, right, on these jobs. And the reason I said it is because we want to keep people in these communities as these communities improve. I've seen so many situations where you see the communities have improved and you have this flight that happens, right? And I think that that's one of the things that we have to, we're learning from the past, we're learning from the past. And I think that's one of the things that we have to make sure is that we're all kind of coming together and seeing all these things that are happening. And I think this is one of the first times that I've seen in my 50 years of that you're having so many different organizations, so many different stakeholders finally sitting down and having these conversations where before it used to be siloed, right? And I think that's what's important for me.
Yeah. Anything else? No? There's a lot of money in equity right now. Never forget the do good stuff. Huge advantages in those trillions of dollars for those of you who pay attention to this, and huge political advantages to all of us if we take care of it early and often.
One more.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Uh-oh. I'm lucky today.
We do this all the time. It's like an act.
David Roberts has a question.
David Roberts has a question?
Hi. I got a mic, so I'm just going to
Okay,
talk.
go for it. Go for it. Is he? Is Dave here, really? There are too many.
Over there.
You already gave us some wonderful examples of large companies, utilities collaborating with small mom and pop businesses, or those sort of cross-sector initiatives, but I'd love it if you could fill the windshield with even more of those successes.
Yeah, I love those. As was mentioned, I used to work at LACY, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, which is doing great work in the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles. And one of the things I love that they did is that we have a huge community in middle of California, Central California, agriculture community. And I want you to guess what population lives and works there. And a lot of times that in those populations, there's ride sharing already occurring, right? But a lot of times, again, as we make this transition to the green side of EVs, we often talk about this idea of EV being more clean and all sort of stuff, but we're failing to mention, it can reduce a lot of your costs that you normally get with these regular gas-powered vehicles. And so it was an organization, a nonprofit organization, that bought a number of Teslas for the community to use as a community vehicle to get back and forth to work. And the community takes turns in utilizing the vehicle, taking others, and it just makes it much easier now for those communities to get to their jobs. And so I like when we're seeing these opportunities like that, where we're going into communities, we're letting the community define what they need. Then we're saying, well, here's a probable solution instead of just forcing it on them. And when I say that, I remember this idea about the similar thing happened in Africa, where we would call it this idea of foreign direct investment or aid. But there, my father's from Sudan, we would call it dead aid. The aid would come as dead on arrival because it's not giving what the community needs. And I think that's a perfect example of some of the things that we need to do here is not have dead aid or dead investment in these communities by not having, like Nicole said, getting out and speaking to the community and saying, what exactly is it that you need? Here's a solution. But that's one I get excited about because it's, again, introducing, it's like this idea of the gateway, again, the gateway idea of introducing people to first clean energy, clean vehicles, and then other ways to kind of think about how can the just transition and the energy transition impact their lives directly.
Anything on that, Ed?
And in terms of my world of kind of public participation and procedural justice and building the village, so to speak, of more stakeholders weighing in on regulatory processes, I'm seeing it everywhere. So, whether it's new organizations beginning to think through how can we strategize around public participation nationally and perhaps, developing or influencing, encouraging state legislators to legislate offices of public participation in state public utility commissions. There's also kind of a new energy around kind of conversations around environmental justice, certainly in the wholesale electricity markets. And there are a lot of groups that are doing great work around kind of what does energy justice, electricity justice look like at the wholesale level. I'm thinking of the PJM, Cities and Communities Coalition, so check them out. But a lot of great work being done, and frankly, we're just kind of at FERC we're holding space for so many stakeholders who wish to be able to have more of a presence at the commission.
We get one more. I feel like the guy's selling.
Apparently, we have one more.
I think I'm the last one more.
But to that though,
I don't know.
Just really
Never
quickly.
know. Go ahead.
There's a company called Ampere. Yes, I invested in Ampere. They're a company, electric airplane company making Cessnas, and electric aviation has been really happening. I love electric school buses. But what I loved about them, and I just came back from the Dominican Republic, is that from an idea of small businesses, if anybody lived in an island or from the Caribbean or even from the Dominican Republic, Cordio, the mail is the mail. But what I love about them is that they're using these electric airplanes to go from island to island to ensure that products or small businesses are able to sell to other islands within the Caribbean more effectively and more cheaply, as opposed to using more expensive going back to Miami and going back and forth. So again, another idea where you're having this clean energy aviation, really kind of focus on a lot of the small business in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and so many other places as well.
This is probably too big of a topic to be bringing up at the very end, but this is for you, Nicole, and maybe you just have a soundbite on it. But one of the big worries right now after the passage of all these laws is going too slow. Everybody sees communities blocking wind farms and solar farms. They see communities blocking dense development in cities. They see just a lot of things getting blocked and a lot of things getting slow, and that's a huge worry among the people I talk to, is just that this thing is not going to go fast enough. How do you think about the relationship between more community consultation and speed?
Mm-hmm. So you do not have permission to publish this. So I'm speaking
completely
personally.
Off the record.
Okay, David?
Completely off the record.
That is a really, look, like, we are living in a climate crisis. We need to get some things done very quickly. However, we cannot pretend like we got to this place because of a great deal of community consultation. I mean, we really didn't. It was definitely many, many generations of top-down kind of decision-making. And we really cannot repeat the habits of the past. I think that, there is opportunity for speed based on what communities actually want for themselves. I think that's the real tension. It's like, the tension is, industry players want and what they think is best and what communities think is best. And frankly, there is expertise and knowledge, great deal of local knowledge about what's best. And so I think that's the real tension.
Should we call it a day? Sounds like a great answer. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Wonderful panel. Thanks to our panelists.
I want a shirt.
You have one. You have one.